After the structured part of the program, we will go into the men's lounge where we will have an informal question and answer period or coffee hour, whichever it may be. First to speak will be Dr. Albert.
Keith Dittman just suggested this afternoon be called the toxicity of religion. I am delighted to see that there were more people present on the UCLA campus for a demonstration of Hatha Yoga than for a discussion of LSD. Because the way it looks from where I stand, Hatha Yoga is the next step, or one of the next steps after you finish with all this. Because this merely shows you the possibility and opens to you a world where then disciplined effort on your own journey is what is in order. So that while Tim Leary, I understand, spoke here the other day, told me when he spoke at Stanford, he took off his shoes and socks, his coat and tie, sat on the stage, and he said, "Never trust a man with his shoes and socks on." So I'm debating, in view of the last presentation, how to up-level Tim's position. I am the first of what I consider three relatively honest men who would like to talk to you about a topic. I think we all see the world slightly differently. You heard the titles, impressive for all of us. Might have said that we were also all formerly children. To find what was in common rather than what was disparate about us. Now, I don't think that Keith, Sidney, and I disagree particularly, or Tim disagree particularly about what's out there. I don't think any of the three of us are out of contact with reality, with that world out there which is called by people who say you're out of contact with reality. I see people taking LSD and going to mental hospitals. I'm sure Sidney sees them and Keith sees them. To me, hospitals are total care institutions. They're like ashrams. They're places where you drop out in order to do some reorganization of your inner being. I see people adopting religion, a religious framework for LSD, as do they. I see people committing suicide, as do they. I see people dropping out. On the Berkeley, out in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, a fellow came up to me, a beautiful, beautiful fellow, barefoot, Levi's, with a begging bowl, and asked me for some bread for lunch, meaning some money for lunch. Maybe. I saw him, and the first thing that went through me was a shudder. My God, is this what's happened? Is this what LSD was all about? And that shudder is a shudder you will hear reflected in the comments, I'm sure, of the gentlemen who follow me. But then the next thought was, just what would it look like if something major were happening to an individual, if he were growing in a very profound inner way? What would be reasonable to expect if his frame of reference had dramatically shifted? You see, we don't disagree about the data we see out there. We disagree about the numbers. We disagree about how to interpret what we see. Now, I can't talk about anybody else, really. I used to be able to as a scientist, but now I can only tell you about what's happening to me. And then I can say, I'm a human being, and I talk to you as human beings, and I invite you to listen and to see what you're going to do about your own human beingness. This is a person-to-person communication. And I can say, what has happened to me as a result of taking LSD inside, and how might that have affected my way of perceiving so that it's so different from these guys you're going to hear next? Now, I can only describe in the most inadequate terms something, it's like, this situation is like being given a multiple choice exam to describe your sexual experiences. Did you pant? Very much, somewhat, a little, not at all. You know? I mean, you can all feel personally, inwardly, the inadequacy of the device to get at the nature of the experience. The perceptual shifts that have taken place, I can say as a couple of things. First of all, that going through an experience where one dissociated, if you will, from one's identity, social identity. One got to a point, I got to a point, forget one, I got to a point where Jewish middle-class boy was over there, where 30-year-old Harvard professor was over there, my Harvard professorness was over there, and I had worked very hard to get that, and suddenly I had taken this drug, Timothy Leary had given me this drug, and there was this thing I had worked so hard to get, and it was over there. And I asked myself, or whoever it was that asks questions, well, if all that's over there, what's here? And I said, well, at least my body is here. And I looked down and my body started to disappear. I started to have an external hallucination. Right? And pretty soon that was gone too. It was all gone. Everything I knew that I counted on, that I said, man, that's who I am and that's what I'm steering through my life, through the ladder of society, it was all gone. And then when the body was gone, I got very panicked, and then finally, okay, heard the rule, swim downstream, let go, went out, and I said, well, what's left? And all there was that was left was like a scanning device, or a point of awareness, or you could say my isness, or the I as opposed to the me. I mean, I can give you metaphor or image after image after image to play with this, because everybody's always tried throughout the mystical ages to describe. You can call it the soul. How about that? But it's that inner thing which doesn't have any of your social identity connected with it. Now, you come back into, you finish the drug trip, come back, and there you are, back in your games again. Put on the robe, put on the identity, and go out into the world. And you look at everybody and they treat you like your identity. But do you know something different now than you knew before? Aha, the knock of 1 minute. You know you have 1 minute to go. What you know now is that all of that indeed wasn't what was the essence of you. You have found, in effect, for a moment, your calm center, or your divinity, or your part in the universe. Take that perceptual shift and put that with the perceptual shift of moving from a time orientation, like yesterday, tomorrow, and planning for the future, Protestant ethic, to a here and now orientation, living for the here and now. Put that with ... perceptual shifts, and you come to a new way of approaching your daily life. I'm just about done. Which is that each moment must indeed justify itself, which means that a guy isn't going to go on with the games unless they make sense to him, unless they feel good, unless they provide satisfaction. And it also means that for me anyway, I went from being what you would call a cynical Western social scientist to being a human being with hope in the possibility that enlightenment even was possible for a Jewish boy from Boston in 1966 in the United States. Can I take 10 seconds off my next one to give a closing line? I mean, I understand how rigid it all is, but... Think only of this parable a little bit as you... because this is the parable which maybe reflect a little difference. You know, it's the one about the guy that's being chased by the tiger, and he comes to the edge of the precipice, and he falls over, and there's a tiger below waiting to eat him, and a tiger above, and he grabs hold of a little branch, and he's holding on to it, and then a little black and white mouse come along, and they started chewing the branch, and it's all like just about to happen, and he looks over, and there are some strawberries, and he picks one, and he tastes it, and he says, "How sweet these are." Right? That's what I'm talking about.
You control yourself.
Next, Dr. Dittman will speak on the problems of LSD evaluation.
I have no personal trips to relate to you. What I'd like to do is get you to kind of join with me and stand back and look at the problems that we have in LSD evaluation as well as the other drugs. For example, the hallucinogens have been around for thousands of years, but none of them are on the market for any medical use. A minority of the people in various cultures have used these drugs that have been available to them. In all instances, there's been controversy over their use. There have been many anecdotal accounts as to their value for aesthetic, philosophical, religious, and psychological, and even parapsychological understanding. But this has never been established by well-controlled studies. That is to say, it may not be possible to do so. This is not to say that it may not be possible to do so. Indeed, where there's enthusiasm, such as Richard has shown you, there may be some fact in it, and I'm willing to take a look if we can use scientific procedures to measure it. LSD is a semi-synthetic compound that has been discovered relatively recently. In this short time, it has gone from a unique, potent changer of consciousness that interested scientists studying the brain and behavior to an experimental psychiatric treatment compound to probably the most rapidly growing problem of drug abuse. The World Health Organization now uses it as the model for one of the 7 classes of drugs that are major drug dependency problems. This swift change has occurred not because of the uniqueness of the LSD intoxication, as there are substances in plants that have been available since time immemorial that give essentially the same kind of experience, but rather because of an unfortunate combination of circumstances. Since World War II, there's been an explosion in interest and the number of compounds made for possible use in medicine and psychiatry. This country and the rest of the world, to an even greater extent, did not have developed the controls, personnel, attitudes, methods, and instruments to adequately deal with these vast number of compounds that were being made available to the public in one way or another. For example, thalidomide, the manufacture of the Salk vaccine, and Mary-29 are only a few of those that were prematurely extensively used. Chlorpromazine, one of the most important and widely studied drugs in medicine, is after a decade of chronic and extensive use just beginning to show effects in humans that question its value. I refer to the persistent dyskinesias and the skin and eye changes. Although we are in an era of spectacular medical advance, there are diseases of medical progress. Some of these problems, but not all, are due to drug side effects. Drug toxicity, both physiological and psychological, are common, and misuse and abuse are frequent. To know what will happen when a drug is introduced into humans, we need to know more than is just basic pharmacology. Who uses it, in what setting, for what purposes, greatly alter the types of physiological and behavioral responses that occur. Even the inert placebo used in a medical situation is not without catastrophic effects at times. In fact, the worst side effect that I have ever seen in my medical practice has been from distilled water. Much information and experience, which takes time to accumulate, needs to be gathered before any given drug can presume to be even reasonably safe. LSD is not even near this degree of understanding yet and should not be treated like popcorn. Evaluation of drugs that alter consciousness are particularly dangerous and difficult to evaluate because they include all the extra complexities of the human brain and human behavior, which is so affected by numerous internal and external factors. Then there are the problems of measurement. These are problems that we have in psychology, psychiatry, as far as to assess change in an individual and certainly change in any given condition that he brings in for treatment, such whether it be neurosis, psychosis, character behavior, or such conditions as the drug dependencies such as alcoholism. We don't know for sure, for example, that the kind of trip a person has from a hallucinogenic drug relates to the kinds of difficulties that they may have afterwards, or even the kinds of benefits they may claim or others may witness. We have an inadequate understanding of what mental illness is, of what treatments are, and how to evaluate them. So it would stand that LSD is certainly not going to be ready for generalized use. And then when one goes to weigh what is good and what is bad effects, as far as changes in an individual, we are up against what we might call value judgments, and what Dick might call a benefit to him in his experiences while he was at Harvard and since may be quite different as far as some of you might evaluate it. So let me conclude a little prematurely and say that though one feels good under a drug or after a drug, that is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for what we can call improvement. Thank you.
Next, Dr. Cohn will speak on LSD myths.
I've been looking at the LSD scene for over a dozen years now, and I'd like to share with you what I think is a whole mythology surrounding the drug. As the advertising people have found out, if you repeat something often enough, people will start believing it. And some of the fables about LSD have been repeated so frequently that both the myth makers themselves and some of their audiences have come to accept them as factual. I'd like to mention a few of these. You can escape the games of life through LSD. How often have we heard this? And now we see the spectacle of T. Leary playing the most orthodox game of all with his League for Spiritual Discovery, the vestments, the Bible, the minion of 6 people plus a lawyer, and all the rest of that. What? I thought he was going to lead us to non-game ecstasy. I'm really disappointed in T. Leary. Now, after a psychedelic experience, one has the ineffable feeling that I've seen the great white light, and after this, all my hang-ups and problems must fade away. I can't possibly be the same person I was before. Indeed, I know whereof these people speak. I have had the similar feeling myself. This is part of the LSD honeymoon period. And alas, all too few of us can make that enormous change from the miserable creatures we were to the miserable creatures we will become. Another, the LSD state is the real reality. You've just heard Richard deal with this. He finally got there. He finally came to the meanness of me. I would submit that the insights garnered under LSD may occasionally have some validity, but all too often they are illusory. I think of the young man recently who had the real firm conviction that he could fly and did not succeed. Or the one here locally who thought he could walk upon the waters in the most intense moment of the psychedelic state. And he apparently defied reality, unsuccessfully. So that many of our notions of this being the utter reality, I say, may not be quite so. Another, reason and logic have brought us to this terrible state the world is in. Get out of this rational consciousness. Even insanity is better than that. I say that we have too little of reason and logic and sense and sensibility in this life, not too much. And this is our trouble. Another, I'm more creative now that I've had acid. What we've found is indeed that people feel they are, but in our studies, and we believe that we would get a positive result, we could not find the objective verification at all. If thinking so makes you more creative, then maybe. On the other hand, one aspect of the LSD experience is to diminish drive, diminish the hard work that it takes to really create, the 90% of creativity being the latter. Another, LSD can't hurt you. Richard, in a book that I once read, said it's your own selfishness, really. I don't think they say that anymore, or at least I haven't heard it very recently. Now it's rephrased into, if only the psychiatrist would go away, LSD complications would never happen. Unfortunately, they started happening before the psychiatrist knew about LSD. So there is a twisting of what seems to be factual into non-factual, and if we say it often enough, we'll believe it. Another twisting. The laws have caused the black market in LSD. This is like believing in precognition, because the black market started 2 or 3 years before the laws were passed. This is sometimes given in this version. The tobacco and alcohol establishment pushed the LSD legislation through. Well, I don't know whether this is true or not, but if anyone has specific information, factual data on this, I would like to hear it. And if these evil industries, I'm not speaking of LSD now, but tobacco and alcohol industries, have spent money trying to ban LSD, it's been a waste of their money. My friends who are taking LSD are still drinking as much and smoking as much as they ever did. Another, LSD is not a drug. You'll hear this occasionally. It was in the Playboy interview of Dr. Leary's. An interview I recommend to every one of you, especially those of you who are taking Logic 1. If you read that interview and can't find at least a dozen illogical statements, contradictory statements, you get an F for the course, F standing for fail in this case. By any definition, LSD is a drug. It has all the pharmacologic, physiologic, psychologic properties of a mind-altering drug. And I'm afraid this is beyond my understanding. I think it's part of the Leary game to make such a pronouncement. Another fable is that the sensational accounts of LSD disasters in the news media are to blame for the current furor. In fact, well over 90%, 95% of the LSD complications have never been reported, either in the medical or in the popular journals or newspapers. I think, I'll take Richard's prerogative of a few more moments. I think that as much furor is created by those sensationalists who made enormous, exorbitant claims for the wonder of the drug. Then there's the myth, and this is a myth of the anti-LSD extremists, and they have a few of theirs, that LSD causes brain damage. At this moment, this is a myth. We cannot, in good faith, produce any proof of this. The only proof is indirect, animal work. And I label this as a myth, just as these other items from the other side are mythical. The final myth I submit is that LSD is either a good drug or a bad drug. It is neither. It is the way in which LSD is used which makes it good or bad. Thank you.
Dr. Alpert?
I was thinking about the profundity of your remarks. Sidney was mad because I didn't applaud him. I was thinking about what he said. It's a terrible desire in these debates always to answer the last point because it just hits you when you've got an answer for it. There are at least 40 points that have been raised, and this is a bizarre procedure. Because they're all really pretty irrelevant to what I think the issue is. I'll just tell a story then in my 3 minutes, just to frustrate you all, that I'm not playing the game because I dropped out. I was lying in the bathtub a few weeks ago, and around 2 in the morning, and the phone rang, and Caroline came in and said, there's a rather anxious girl on the phone who says her brother's flipped out. So I said, well, bring the phone in, and I got her. I said, where is he? She says, he's in the bathroom, in the bathtub. I was in New York, and he was in California. And I said, the phone reached the bathroom? Yes, it does. And we'll put him on. I said, hello? He said, I'm going crazy. I'm going to do something violent. I'm going to hurt myself or somebody else. I said, well, then there's no real sense in us talking. Why don't you just go do whatever you were going to do? I said, but I'll tell you, if by any chance you don't want to do all that, have you got a candle around? Yeah, they had a candle. Well, bring it into the bathroom and light the candle, and I have a candle. I'm in the bathtub, too. Isn't that interesting? We both lit the candles and turned out the lights. Now let's look into the candle. Let's find our calm center again. Now, we talked for 40 to 50 minutes. After about 30 minutes, we were both breaking up completely. The water had gone cold, and we both had heated it up. He said, this is very expensive, and I pointed out that $1 for 3 minutes, it was less expensive than a psychoanalytic interview. Now, at the end of 50 minutes, we had indeed just become just so beautifully in tune with one another, and the conversation ended. I got a letter from his sister last week which said an interesting thing. He was so frightened beforehand that they called their doctor, and the doctor's answering service said that he was away, but they would get another doctor. And while I was talking to this fellow, the doorbell rang, and a doctor appeared, and he said, "I am Dr. So-and-so," and with him was a policeman. And the doctor said, "I have been told there is an LSD psychopath loose here." Thank you.
Dr. Dittman?
There have been a number of studies which are reasonably well controlled in order to attempt to prove some of the kinds of claims that have been made by those who are enthusiastic about LSD as far as a psychiatric treatment. And unfortunately, none of those to date are showing results that would indicate that LSD is superior in a treatment as far as any other particular drug or reasonably other form of treatment. In other words, the control groups are doing about equally as well as the LSD treated groups. Now, this isn't to say that LSD is not a potentially valuable treatment for certain psychiatric illnesses, particularly some of the neuroses, behavioral disorders, and perhaps alcoholism. The problem is that, as I mentioned before, it's difficult to measure changes. It's difficult to build into a particular study the kinds of things that you want to have in it and also then be able to measure it. And it's difficult to have an adequate control group. There is a certain thing that often leaves a controlled clinical study, and that is the kind of enthusiasm that many who are in favor of LSD for either enlightenment or aesthetic appreciation or as a psychiatric treatment lack. And so that what you're left with is two groups, one treated with LSD and the other, the control group, perhaps treated with some other drug such as perhaps Ritalin. But they haven't been given the enthusiasm that goes with the user or the therapist with LSD treating a non-control group. In other words, when a person knows that there's one group not getting their favorite treatment, their enthusiasm wanes. And this shows in the kind of response the patients have. The study we have in the south of this state is running just about like that. Those who volunteer for the treatment are doing better than those who refuse to volunteer for the treatment or don't wish to volunteer for the treatment. But this might be expected. Alcoholics who are motivated for any treatment do better than those who are not motivated for any given treatment. But within the drug-treated group, those who are receiving LSD so far, and this is two-thirds through the study, at least on a simple measure of whether or not they fall off the wagon, those receiving LSD are not doing better than those who don't. So that the problem remains that there are so many factors in evaluating a drug and what it's going to do in a person and what the person is going to do in their environment that is very difficult to establish as effective a particular treatment. And it's easy to take one's own experience and extrapolate from that. But this, of course, really isn't adequate. You can remember what Noah had to say about alcohol, and after a few thousand years, you can see the kinds of problems we have with it now. So, because someone has had a beatific experience or feels they have been helped, or they have gained understanding, this isn't adequate to establish that this particular modality is a worthwhile treatment measure. Some of our subjects a few years ago made similar claims after being given distilled water in a setting where they thought they were receiving LSD. Thank you.
Dr. Cohn?
Maybe I ought to extrapolate on what Richard said in his non-rebuttal, because that is interesting. Namely, what do you do until Richard Alpert comes when you're in trouble?
He's everywhere.
This is not lightly said, because it is true that people do get into trouble with LSD of various sorts, and it is also true that many of these troubles can be handled immediately and aborted. Talking someone down, as Richard suggested, is, I think, an excellent means of doing this thing for people in a panic or in a paranoid state. And naturally, you need a worthy person to do this thing, a person who can feel into this terror-stricken individual, the guy who thinks he's going crazy, and build a verbal and nonverbal bridge to him and pull him back over the bridge into a better feeling. This is first aid for the psychedelic panic, and I approve of it highly. I think that anyone who takes LSD without someone around who can do this thing is playing double chemical Russian roulette. It's an added hazard, so that this is a good thing to do. And this will sometimes, I don't know how often, take care of the problem. We have done it. We rarely use chemicals when some of our people are having difficulties. We talk them out of it. Talk is a powerful item, despite the high value put on a nonverbal by the nonverbalists. Now, I'm not going to make too many rebuttal comments, too, because like Richard, I feel there's nothing to rebut. I would like to say something about what seems to be a pervasive trend, a yearning which many of us have, namely a wish to return to spiritual childhood, a return to spiritual nature. In the old days, the 17th and 18th century French royalty would go to their balls decked in peasant costumes, a return to the land, you know. And then there was Rousseau, who wanted to return to nature, and Thoreau, and you know, in every one of us there is the yearning to get back to the natural. I think that this is a part of our search for our roots. And especially in these days, roots are hard to come by. May I offer, off the top of my head, another possibility? Maybe we ought to cut our roots and fly. Maybe these returns to childhood and to nature are not the goal of man. Maybe we should take off and go in the direction our brain is going, to increased rationality, to the age of reason and logic. And during those periods of man's existence, the golden age of Greece, the Renaissance, little islands between millennia of dank superstition and witches and witchcraft, these were the high points of man's achievement. Now, what shall it be? Shall it be art, architecture, the sciences? Shall it be knowledge, an attempt to understand this life, to learn more, to understand the nature of the universe? Or shall it be this return to the childhood process of feeling as though one were at one with? I think at least the direction should be the direction of what is called the scientific revolution. I value the importance of the feeling, the emotion, the senses, the pleasures, but I think we have some other place to go.
Dr. Albert, you can stay there if you want.
Oh, no, I'd like to stand. Oh, Sydney, if we only could return. The gentleman who you said I talked down, in fact, he talked me up. I was stoned by the end of my bath. Keith, of course, those that want the drug will do better. That's the whole idea. A person has to choose to do something with his own life. Nobody's going to do it to him or for him. And that's where psychiatry days are numbered, because professionalism is not the game. From here on in, each man is his own minister, each man saves his own soul. It's a do-it-yourself world we're entering into. You either make it or you don't. Return to what? Return to where man was in tune with the universe. We bought Florence Kluckhohn's, in Florence Kluckhohn's distinction, a model of man over nature. That's the scientific revolution. We become enamored of our own products, like the fecal revolution, I'd almost call it. The alternative is man in nature, man in tune with and in harmony with the universe. I personally have had enough of the psychosis of Lyndon B. Johnson. I have had enough of the psychosis of psychiatry. I'm fed up with neurosis. The whole thing bores me. And I would look, last Saturday I was in San Francisco with 30,000 people in Golden Gate Park, just all being together. They all take drugs. And they're all living dangerously. And I'll tell you, it is dangerously. You know how dangerous it is? Take my metaphor. Let's imagine that instead of the game being, let's go on with a scientific revolution, think of what it was like to come out of the ocean and be the ones to climb up on the land. And all the fish down in the ocean saying, you'll never make it, it's dangerous, you can't breathe, you don't have the apparatus, you need a doctor's care, be very careful. Damn right it's dangerous. Some people flop about and they scare themselves, and some people just die in the process. Evolution goes on. I really, sincerely, deeply, maybe completely crazily, because I've been drugging myself out of my head for the past 5 years, I honest to God believe that man's next evolutionary step are higher levels of consciousness that lie within him, and I do not presently think Western psychiatry has a goddamn thing to say about those topics.
Dr. Didman?
Well, being a psychiatrist, and seeing the people who have had bad after effects from LSD, I ask myself about what Dick says, and I feel that he really isn't in contact or in tune with his environment. You should see some of them. People who don't want to live because there's no way for us to get them feeling better. Some are not in the hospital, some are. Some have not been able to continue here at UCLA or some of the other campuses about. And there are a strange group of people with curious difficulties that we haven't really classified adequately yet. They're new, and we haven't found ways to treat them. And when they come on, it may be after one trip, or it may be after several, or even dozens. They can be of all kinds of things: depressions, anxieties, feelings of derealization, depersonalization, chronic inability to concentrate, frank psychoses, and yet they don't respond to the kinds of treatment that other conditions with more or less similar symptoms have, in other conditions that is not drug-induced, do respond to. I'm concerned, and I don't know about this world that man had when he was in tune with the universe and it was also perfect, other than the myth of, we think that LSD may have a valuable place in medicine, just as morphine does, or certain of the anesthetics. But I don't think it's a thing for a psychologist or a non-psychologist, person not trained in the use of drugs and the practice of medicine, and with colleagues that make up for deficiencies that that particular individual may have. In other words, an adequate team. It's not the thing for that type of person to play with. I know, in talking with Dr. Leary before he went to Zihuatanejo, he told me they were going to have pharmacologists, they were going to have biochemists, they were going to have physicians and so forth to do things right in Mexico that they couldn't do here. What happened is they didn't have that. They didn't do things right. There were problems. I've seen some of those problems since. So I think it's a myth when people promise that LSD is going to do something for you beneficial. I think that one is being seduced, if I may use the word, into taking a chance with their own mental stability. And I see no real call to use the drug other than in a treatment setting at this time. That is, treating an individual where, as it were, a matter of life and death. Someone, for example, diagnosed alcoholic, severely alcoholic, where perhaps their chance of living 5 or 10 years is the most you could expect. It is warranted when you have no treatment like that to use something that may or may not help them, make them worse or make them better. I can see the moral justification of using LSD in the best kind of study you can with conditions like that. But I can't see even advocating, encouraging, in any way abetting the free use that has been done, I think, today and done in the past. Thank you.
Dr. Kuhn.
Let's set this business of the disasters that occur with LSD aside. Let's fantasy a little that imagine that LSD never could cause any trouble, any craziness or whatever, any suicides. Forget all that for a moment. What about the validity of the state? This is the question. Surely up there, where the critical function of the self is wiped out, it sure seems valid. And as I said before, people have acted upon this validity and have failed. And not only is it occasionally invalid, we have to ask ourselves, I think after we come back down, what does it mean? Sometimes I think it may have meaning, but I think we have to ask ourselves, we cannot, without the use of that terrible thing called the intellect, unquestionably accept the insights of this state. Now, I'd like to close by reading a few quotes, just in case you should be under the illusion that we're dealing with something brand new, rather than some cyclic process which other generations have been through before with other agents. Let me read from that esteemed psychologist William James, whom we all admire, who in 1901 said, "The sway of alcohol over mankind is unquestionably due to its power to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature, usually crushed to earth by cold facts and dry criticisms of the sober hour." I think he was speaking of something LSD-ish. He also said, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, nitrous oxide and ether stimulates the mystical consciousness, depth beyond depth. This was 65 years ago. Nitrous oxide is an interesting thing for you to study. I think if you were to study this thing historically, you might come up with a lot of interesting information. It was, its strange powers was first mentioned by Dr. Davy, a biochemist, and Sam Coleridge said something like this: "I experienced the most voluptuous sensations. The outer world grew dim, and I had entrancing visions. I lived in a world of new sensations." Peter Roget, whose Thesaurus was later written, said, "Mr. Davy's silk bags hold the keys to paradise." We know that it's LSD, not nitrous oxide, that hold the keys to paradise. And so we go. I have quote after quote here indicating that opium, methadone, benzodrine, all these agents have at one time or another produced the same state of psychedelic ineffability. And I will predict that none of these chemicals, or any chemical, is the wave of the future. If you really want to get way out, fellers and girls, have those electrodes implanted in your head and get those, be able to buzz yourself so that you can, don't depend on occasionally once or twice a week taking acid. It's not reliable enough. Get your electrodes implanted in the pleasure center, and you can buzz yourself all day long, every day, and you can feel ineffable and ecstatic, and it'll... Thank you.